Hello class, this week we will be covering particles. And you might think to yourself, well, what's a particle? Basically, a particle is something that is born onto the screen, does something, then dies and leaves the screen. So in After Effects, they have a certain amount of time that they can be on the screen, and that's up to you as the designer. Now you can get third-party plugins that have constant particles, but we're just dealing with what comes with After Effects, and these are particles that are born, they live for a certain amount of time, they do something, and then they fade off the screen, they die. Okay? A particle can be anything you want it to be, and we'll go dive into that this week. You're going to learn a lot about particles. Particles are either born out of a producer or a canon or a layer. It depends upon which particle system you're using. There's 3 of them in After Effects: Particle System 2, Particle World, and Particle Playground. What I have up in the background is Particle World. Particle World is the only 3D particle system in After Effects. The other 2 deal with 2D. You can't see it because it's invisible, but my producer's up here and the particles are coming out from there. You can use whatever you want to make a particle. There's default particle types, or you could use images or videos. We're going to tackle that coming up. We're going to be learning about using the default particles and then designing your own images to use as particles and getting a custom look that you want. Particle systems are a great way to fill up space, save time, and add some richness to your animation. Just a warning, the more particles you have or the more intricate your particle system, the longer it will take to render. For this particle system, I used a cloud shape just to get you started. So what you're seeing is a bunch of cloud images being emitted out of the particle producer. Okay? Now we're going to start diving in to particles. We're going to start with the more simple ones and work our way up to the more complex particle systems. We're going to start by creating a new composition, 1920 by 1080. And 24 frames is fine. Now we're going to add a new solid layer in here. I got there by right-clicking inside the empty space, and you can also get there by going Layer New, Solid up at the top. I've already got my particles typed in, and we're going to add one of these as an effect to the solid layers. We're going to start off with Particle Playground. There's the effect added, and you see nothing happen, but when you hit the spacebar, now you can see your particles being born. So remember, anything can be a particle. Each one of these little dots coming out is the particle. Right here is the cannon that they're shooting out of, like a water fountain, okay? The cannon is shooting them up and gravity is pulling them down. So first rule of particles is work on the motion first, then try to get the particle to look the way you want it. Worry about the motion first, then dial in how the actual particles look, okay? It's a 2-step process. Okay, so in my effects controls, I twirl down Particle Playground, and here's the cannon. The position, obviously, is where it is. Remember, you could always use the crosshairs, click once and then click again, or you can use your value sliders, or you could type in an absolute number. It's all up to you as the designer. And just a little tip, 960 by 540 usually will shoot you to the center of the screen. The barrel radius is how wide it is coming out of the cannon. So it could be even a negative number if you want. Number of particles per second obviously is how many or how few are coming out of the particle system each second. Remember, the more particles you have, the longer your render will be. Like up here in my info panel, it'll tell you the total number of particles being used. Direction shows which direction they are coming out of the cannon. You could always add random elements to get a more organic look. velocity is how far they're traveling out once they shoot out of the particle system. You see here I've got a tighter group, whereas if I increase the velocity, they're flying out much further and faster. It's the strength they're coming out more or less. You could also randomize the velocity across time. At this point, they're almost looking like a swarm of bugs at this point. Obviously, you can change the color of the particle. And the radius of the particle will be how big the particle is. That's not how far across the screen it's going. Radius is the actual size of the particle being emitted. Grids would be for working within a grid system, and we're not using a grid for this example. Layer exploder. So I have a text layer here. If I choose layer exploder, and then choose that layer that is the text from the drop-down menu, I'm also going to drop down my preview resolution just to save myself some time here. I'm going to precompose my type and see if that helps me along the way, and move all attributes, hit OK, go back to my layer with the effect. Now you see the particles coming out of the text in the shape of that layer. So let me change my barrel. So once I got rid of my settings for the cannon, now it's only emitting from the layer. So like I said, troubleshoot. I had both of these. I had particles coming out of the cannon as well as the layer. So I just got rid of the cannon settings. Now it's only showing the text settings. So you've seen this a million times in commercials where like maybe salt or something will form the shape of the logo. So you could either have it coming out or reverse it into it like that to get that effect. And radius of the new particle, that's how big the particle is coming out, as well as the dispersion, how fast they're coming out of it. Now, particle exploder. I've got a whole mess of drop downs. So if I go to layer exploder, because that's where they're coming out of the text, let's watch and see what happens. Age feather would be how old or young the particles are that are being affected. We could pick a layer to use as a layer map. And change the settings, and we'll see what that does to our particle system. I'm going to go back to the default just because that's taking too long. Hide that. Now you can see I've got the word logo as a particle. Following the other particles. That's my layer map. So whatever that layer is will become that particle. I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to precompose this smiley face and then hide it so it's a layer inside my panel. So if I go to my layer exploder, the particles will come out of that layer, which is not what I want. But if I go to layer map and choose that smiley face, now my particles are that smiley face. And a general rule of thumb, when you're making a custom particle, you're going to want it to be as small as possible. So usually 200 by 200, no more than 400 by 400. Okay, the smaller it is, the faster you'll go because it's using a smaller image to generate the particle, and make sure the entire particle is inside of that small comp. Now you can see it's coming out much faster. So again, if I zero out, here we go, particles per second. So that's our layer map. And again, this will affect the time of the particles, like how long they've been on the screen, as opposed to newer or older ones. Gravity. I increase the gravity, they're going to be pulled towards the Earth. If I go negative, they're going to drift upwards, almost like tiny flecks of dust that are lighter than air. We can increase the force of them, as well as change the direction. I'm going to delete all these layers. And create a new comp. I'm going to make sure it's 1920 by 1080. Hit OK. Next, we're going to look at CC Particle System 2. So I'm going to create a new solid with my timeline selected, layer new, solid, and we're going to do Particle System 2. And I'm going to hit the spacebar. And now you can see the particles automatically being generated. So birth rate is how many of them there are, or how few there are. Always remember, the more particles you have, the more time it's going to take to render and eat away at your computer. Longevity is how long they're staying on the screen. So the longer they stay, you could do a juggling act of have fewer particles but staying a longer amount of time, or do more particles staying for a very short amount of time, like a firework would have a lot of particles that last a short amount of time. So it's a juggling act of how long are they on the screen and how many are on the screen. The position is where the particles are coming out from the particle system. These are coming out of a producer. The other particle system used a cannon. The radius for the producer is how narrow or wide, or how short or tall that system is coming out of. So I'm going to make that more narrow. Now, under physics, these are the physics engines that create the different particle motions. Twirl and twirly have different looks, as do vortex or fire. I'll stick with vortex. So if I say, well, I like the way the vortex physics engine is working, but it's up too high, then I would change the Y position on the producer. X side to side, Y up and down. Now I could say, well, I want this to be, taller. Now you see I've got a completely different look, as opposed to me doing it that way. You can change your settings and try and get a more dialed in approach to your particle system. Velocity, like we showed before, how fast and far they're traveling out of that producer. See how they're coming in tighter with less velocity? See, they're not shooting out as far. Whereas if I increase it, now they're starting to travel up further. Inherent velocity, gravity. If I increase the gravity, they're not rising as far. If I decrease the gravity, they're flying up higher. Remember, gravity will either pull it to the Earth or push it up towards the sky. Resistance basically affects the strength of the particle system. See, they're going a bit tighter in, whereas if I get rid of the resistance, they're traveling further away. Direction, it's not really affecting this one as much. Let's try fire. Nope, direction's not really affecting that one either. Extra, we'll just add some randomness to it. See how now they're not as tight up in the middle and we're getting a little bit more of a scatter to it. The more you adjust the extra, it'll keep giving you a different look. So you can always hit undo to get back to the one that you liked. Once we've got our motion looking the way we want, we could change the particle type with one of the default ones. The birth size, how big they are once they come out, or how small they are. You can have them get larger over time, or you could have them be the same size through their birth and their death. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have these be born smaller and get larger as they die. The longevity, let's crank that up. And then what I'll do, size variation, I'll crank that up to 100. And then I'll crank it down to 0. And let's leave it at 50. That's going to be how much variation there is in the size coming out. Opacity map, fade out, means they're fading as they're born. If I change that to constant, they're not fading on, they're not fading off. Maximum opacity. That's the maximum amount of opacity the particle can be. If I set it to 100, now you can see that. It's not disappearing. So if I do fade in, fade out, see how they're fading in and fading out as they're born? And oscillate gives you this random wiggling in and out look. Color map, birth to death. You could do origin constant, where it's a constant look. Or I could say, I want these born a certain color. I'll click blue, then I'll have them be born, I'll have them turn purple as they die. Let's make them live less. Because right now, the birth of the particle system, I had cranked up very high, but it was longer than my composition, so you weren't seeing the death color. So see, now that I have them living less, now you can see the color change. This is the color they are when they're born, and then as they live longer, they'll change color and start to fade off. Transfer mode, composite would be solid, screen, they would get brighter, and then add each level on top would get brighter on top of that one. It's just basically with your compositing. If this looks too hot, try and lower your birth rate. See, now I've got that nice light effect where they're blending onto one another, but it's not too severe. Now we've got some color change going on. Random seed, we'll just randomize some of your time settings that you've got and give you a bit more of a random feel to it. And then you could always just change your particle engine and experiment and see what the different ones look like once you've got your thing set up. That is Particle System 2. The difference between Particle System 2 and Particle Playground was Particle Playground gave us the ability to explode layers. Particle System 2 does not allow you to do that, but you've got more default particles inside here, plus more physics engines. But you can do a little bit more creative stuff with Particle Playground than Particle System 2. Particle System 2 is fairly useless because the main one we're going to use, I'm going to go back here, make a new layer. I have to make sure my timeline's selected. Layer new solid, and I'll call this one Particle World, and I'll hit OK. And here's Particle World, and I'll put on that layer. Now again, as I said, so Particle System 2 doesn't have much use. Particle Playground, you can explode layers or use some custom particles. Particle World, however, is a full 3D particle system. So that means if I add a camera by going layer new camera, I hit OK. Now I hit my C key. See, I can fly around and then look at my particle system where I can zoom and orbit around it. I can track and pan and tilt with it, or zoom in or out of it. So you can fly through this particle system if you choose to. I'm going to delete that camera. CC Particle World, the 3D one, you can use this to put special effects into a scene and then match up the perspective to it using this grid system here. And if the grid is distracting you don't need it to look into a scene, you could just turn off your grid, click off all this so that you focus solely on your particles. But the grid is there to help you line up your particles into a shot that you've already done. So I'm hitting the spacebar to preview this. We already know birth rate, how many of them there are coming out per second. The higher the number, the more there are. Longevity, that's how long they live. Now if my composition's 7 seconds, it's silly for me to set this any higher than 7 seconds because the particle would live longer than the composition. You won't see the changes. And remember, if you go to info, you'll see the amount of particles that you've got happening. So I could always dial this down a little bit if it's too much because I've got them living for about 7 seconds. You can have them live however long you want. Like if I have them only live for 1 second, you can see they're yellow when they're born and they're red when they're dying. So you can already see that change in the particles happening already. I'll lower that down so you can see a little better. The producer, the position, where it is side to side, or up and down, or how close or far it is from your camera. These settings will also help you line your particles up into your shot. Or say, I like the tail end of this, like I want a more rain drizzle look. I can have that particle system off the screen and just have the tail end of it. It's all up to you as the designer. Have those closer or further from the camera. That's one of the benefits of the 3D particle system. The radius, obviously how wide or narrow it is, how tall or short it is, or how much Z space it takes up. Now these particles are much deeper into my shot, going through more in space and time. That's another benefit of a 3D particle system. Physics. This is where you change the motion. Let's stick with vortex for now. So suppose I don't like the position of that. I can just change my position on here. And I can say maybe that's a little too much in Z space. So I can decrease how deep this is. Velocity. That's how far and fast they're traveling from where they're born out of the producer. So you can adjust that as you need to. Gravity. More gravity will pull them towards the Earth. Negative gravity will be lighter than gravity and they'll drift upwards. I'm going to set that back to 1. I'm going to set it to 0. There we go. Resistance will tamp down the strength of the particle system, as you can see. Resistance is a great way to troubleshoot. Like say you want to have a bunch of flowers pop up in a field. Well, if you crank up the resistance, then the flowers won't be floating off the ground. It'll help hold them onto the ground and give you a more realistic pop-on animation form. Random will be how much randomness is added into this. We'll get into the floor in a second. Gravity vector isn't really factoring anything in here. That's probably going to affect with the floor. Okay, now before we dive into the floor, I'm going to show you about custom particles. And again, remember, in the physics, the resistance, that's going to help you out a lot with some of these overly strong particle systems. So remember the first thing I said, if you're making a custom particle, set up a new composition and you want it to be between 200 and 400 as a square, like 200 by 200 or the maximum 400 by 400. Don't go beyond that. You don't need the space. I'll call this Cloud PC. And then I drag the shape I want into it. It's this transparent cloud. And I've got to scale it down. You want the entire image to fit inside of the composition settings. So take a look at this. I have nothing happening right now. And I'm going to show you what's going to change when we do this. All right, so for particle, I'm going to change our particle type. Down here, these are how you bring in custom particles. If I do texture square, it's going to have, I'll show you that one next. I'm going to do texture faded disk. What a faded disk is going to do, it's going to have soft edges all around, and it's going to be circular or oval shaped. Okay, and so next I've got my texture faded disk chose. I've got to go below texture and choose the, forgot to add this in. I put my cloud pre-comp inside and I hide it. So now when I go to my particle type, I've got my texture faded disk, there's my texture, and I choose the pre-comp. Now I've got that cloud as my particle. Okay, and we could already see how I've got the original motion, but I've got this cloud shape happening. Again, birth size, how large it is when it's born. Death size, how large it is when it's dying. So you can see it's getting larger over time. The color, it's being born yellow and it's dying at red. I could affect the maximum opacity if I want, and I could increase the size variation. So these born a little bit bigger. Like such. Let's increase the longevity of them. Let's decrease it. And we'll have more of them being born. Like such. Now, suppose I don't want to color this over time. I can make it any color I want. I could go for a more magical look, going blue to, say, green, for a more sci-fi feel. And I could also start dialing in my look by stretching them out on the Y if I wanted, and dialing back on the resistance in the physics, like such. But I want you to notice what's going to happen here in a second. If I decrease the opacity, I can get more of a foggy, misty look, like a gas. If I increase it, I'll get a thicker, denser look. So when you're working with smoke and gas and fog, your opacity will affect how dense that's going to look. Another important tip, if you want it to be the exact color of the image you brought in, set your birth and death to white, and then that will not color the particle over time. So this is what it looks like when you have a still image. Now watch this. I've got my still image. I can add turbulent displace to it. And let's say I animate that. So I go to my offset, click my bar, my crosshairs, and then I choose where I want them to end. So you can see my cloud moving and being distorted. Okay, I can increase that amount if I want. And I can mess with the size. So it's doing it more frequently at less of a size. Now watch what happens when I go back here. Now the actual individual particles are moving while the particle system is spreading them out. You can see they have life. It's always a better idea to add some motion to your still particles whenever possible to get a more interesting animation. See, this has far more visual interest to it with that particle having some motion to it. It's got a more realistic effect as opposed to it just being a still image. See, like that. So again, physics, resistance. This can help you make the particle system a little less strong and keep your elements together a little better, especially if you don't want them flying off the ground as much. That's a key takeaway from this. If you do not want your particle to be changing over time and you want to use the color of the image you're using, set the birth and death color to white under the particle settings. And if you need a custom particle for particle type, choose one of these bottom three, okay? And I'm going to show you the other settings. So this is a texture faded disc. It softens on each edge because you can see there's no hard edges where these clouds meet. It's a nice, smooth, soft blend of the particles coming out, okay? I'm going to change this in a second. I'm going to keep these settings, but I want to show you something. I'm going to use our smiley. I'm going to drag it in here, and I'm going to hide them, okay? I'm going to go back to my particle, layer, and the effect. I'm going to keep everything but change my particle settings. So I'm going to go from texture faded disk to texture square, and I'm going to change my texture layer to the smiley face. Okay? Now, there are hard edges. They're not feathering together. That's the first thing I want you to notice. The second, watch what happens when I hit scatter. When you scatter the image, you are not scattering the particle, you're scattering the picture inside the random particles. No scatter, you see the full smiley face. You increase the scatter, and it's going to randomize what it's showing you of the image and where inside each particle. Okay? Bear that in mind when you're using hard, square particle systems with a scatter. Alright? You might get unwanted results. So we covered using the hard particle, no fade. That's just with a square. I showed you doing the faded disk to soften the edges. And I showed you how to animate a still image inside your custom particle. Alright? Let's kick this up a notch. I'm going to delete all my layers, and I'm going to create a new particle. I'll call it fire. Now, I've got a 200 by 200. Fine. And in Canvas, you'll find the green screen fire clip. It's in one of the weeks. I believe it might be week 7 or week 8, but you can look for that on your own time. I'm going to, first I gotta remove the green screen, and I do that with key light. Here's my key light. I throw it on the video clip. I click my eyedropper. I choose the green. Now the fire is with alpha because it removed the green screen. Fine. But if I make this a particle now, it's going to put the green back in from the green screen. So I right click, Precompose, and call it fire. And now it's inside this one nested. So I'm going to close my fog there. I'm going to add a new solid. I'll call it particle. Hit OK. Throw particle world on it, the 3D one. So I renamed the precomposed fire, Fire 2, just so I don't have any confusion here. I'm going to grab Fire 2, add it to my composition, and hide it by clicking the eye icon. So now, if I go to my particle, and I choose Texture Faded Disk, twirl down Texture, and choose Fire 2, and move forward, I now have the flames there. But here's an important thing. When I dive into here, this particle is only 3 seconds long, so I can duplicate it, hold down Shift, snap it to the edge, duplicate it again, hold down shift, snap it to the edge. Now it's going to live a bit longer. I can scrub through here and you don't see the particle disappearing. Again, I just affect the birth size and the death size. Fire gets larger as it's over time. And another thing to consider is I'm going to set it from white to white to keep the color of the original image. So composite, we kept composite on for the smoke because smoke has density, but fire I could use screen or add because it's more of a light effect. And then I can decrease the maximum opacity if it starts getting too bright or blown out. Like such. So think about it. Is it a light effect? Well, if it is inside your particle, you might want to do screen or add. Screen will brighten it and make it glow. Add will make it go bright on top of bright on top of bright. So every fire particle that goes on top of the next one makes it that much brighter. It's an additive result. So you gotta be more careful that you're gonna have to mess around with your opacity far more than if you just choose screen. See, there's far less overexposure happening. That's all up to you as the designer. When you should use screen or add, or just do it a solid composite for a solid look. That's all up to you. So that's how to remove the green screen and use that particle. One more thing I want to show you is down here, extras. And then there's hold particle release. I can click here, go forward one frame, and turn it up to 100. So it's going to be an instant burst of particles rather than that weird birth that we're seeing happening on with them. I can also add some randomness here, get a different look. And there you have it. That's a good way to get an explosion come out fast, and if I want this to only be on the screen for a short amount of time, I would then animate the birth rate, go forward, send that to 0, and then you'll see the particles go away after a moment. Say they fade off about here. We can preview that, turn off my grid. So we're going to tackle the grid in a second, because there is a need for it. So there you see the particles being born on faster by doing that hold particle release, and then I keyframed off their life, okay? That's one thing I wanted to show you. I'm going to reset that particle effect. I'm going to get rid of the fire. Remember, golden rule of working with particles: focus on the motion, then get the particle to look the way that you want. Now, in the canvas files, I've got some paint splotches, or you can just find some transparent paint. I'll call it paint, make it 200 by 200 because you do not want your custom particle size to be too large. And I'll scale this down, like such. And I'll add the paint particle back here and hide it. Okay. So, I want to show you something. I'm going to go to my particles, and I'm going to go to the physics engine and choose fire. I'm now going to hit the spacebar, and you can see the effect happening. I like the way this particle engine moves, but I don't want it going in that direction. I want to have a paint splotch fill up the screen, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my extras and then affect camera. Now watch my grid. Nope, that's not the right axes. That's not the right axes. It's this one. So that's going away from the camera. If I go in the opposite direction, it's now going towards the camera. I could always double click highlight over it and use the up or down arrows once that's there to dial it in perfectly. So now you can see this is the motion that I want, okay? I can then dial in the look by going to the producer. And remember, since we rotated it, X, Y, and Z will now be doing different things. Since I want this to fill up the screen, first we can hide the grid because we're done rotating it. We know it's going towards the camera in the way that we want it to. Now I'm going to put in my particle and then dial in the look, just because once the particle's in, I'll be able to work more easily. Since I'm using a custom particle, I'm going to want a texture faded disk for soft edges, and then under texture, I'm going to choose paint. I'm going to set these to white to keep the color. I'll have them grow larger as they die. So once I had the rough idea, then I can, and I've got my particle in, now I can fine tune the look a little bit more easily. I'm going to crank up my resistance. And I'm also going to show you the opacity map. If I twirl down here, this means it's fading on and fading off. I don't want that, so I hover over and I get a pen and I can fill that in. Now it's not fading on or off. If I wanted to fade off, that's what fade off would look like. Actually, that's what fade on would look like. That's fade off. That's fade on, and that's not fading off or on. Now they're sticking together a little bit tighter. I'll increase the birth rate, make them live a little longer, and then make them larger as they die. Now the paint is filling up the screen, like such. So that was just showing you what opacity maps do. And I'm going to kick this up a notch. I'm going to hit U to hide these keyframes, increase my render area, drop my preview resolution. Let's say I've got an image I want to reveal. I'm going to put that below my particles. I'm in my switches. I need to be in my modes. Remember, a mask goes over your face, so the particles are on top because that's what I want to use, what I want to reveal. I click that layer, choose Alpha Matte. I want that to start a little later, so I'll just move that down and then change it. There we go. I've now got a custom transition reveal on. You've all seen this before. It's sort of like the Sherlock effect, and I've done a tutorial on that, but we can dive into that a little bit later on. Just remember, a particle, it's born onto the screen, it does something, and then it dies. You can use whatever you want as a particle and focus on your motion, then the look of the particle. And you can use the particles for anything you want. You can use them for effects, you can use them as backgrounds, or you could use them to create custom transitions like we have right here. It's all up to you as a designer to see how creative you want to get and how you want to push your designs. Also, don't forget, instead of an alpha matte, you could use it as a luma matte if there's a lot of value changes to it as well. So just give me some pointers there. Now I'm going to demonstrate some more best practices when using particles. I'm just cleaning up my workspace to make it easier for myself. And remember, when you're making a custom particle, you want it to be between 200 and 400 pixels. You don't want it to be too large or it'll slow down your machine. I'm going to call this one Smoke. And I have to scale my artwork down to make sure it fits completely inside. There we go. And I'm going to give it a little bit of life with the turbulent displace. And I'm just going to animate the offset from side to side. Remember, you click once, and that's the fast way of just getting the crosshairs to be more precise with where you want it to move, rather than figuring out the map there with the numbers. Actually, I'm going to change that. I want this to move upwards, because the smoke will be rising. So let's see how that looks. Better? Okay. So I've got that particle, custom particle ready. And I'm just making a new scene to put it into. I'm going to hide it. Next, I'm going to need to make 1 for the fire. And I'll scale that down to make sure it fits in. And I'm going to remove the green screen using key light. I click my eyedropper and I find the green. That's all done. Now I have to pre-compose it, or else the green will be back inside the particles, and I'll call this fire particle. And I'm going to move all attributes into new composition. I'll add that to my scene and I'll hide it. So I've got my fire, I've got my smoke, and lastly I need my embers. Now there's a lot of them here. I only want one of them. And I'll pre-compose this and I'll call this Ember Particle. And I'll add my Ember Particle to the scene and I'll hide it. So now I'm going to want to make one effect, but to get the best result, I'm going to use multiple particle layers. You're going to find this a lot, that you're going to need to do more than one layer for your particles. Like there'll be one layer for the fire, one layer for the smoke, one layer for the embers. And then I'm going to make a shape with the fire that's a little larger to use as a displacement map to change the background, like the heat would do. That's a good use for displacement maps, is heat and haze effects. So first, I'm going to make a new solid, and I'll call this one fire, and I'll hit OK. And I'm going to put particle world on it. That's the 3D one. The closer I get this looking, I can try and use the same particle engine with some minor tweaks, but I might use different engines for each effect. You gotta look and think about it critically. And again, that's up a little too high in the scene, so I'm going to move it down a little bit. And I'm going to increase the resistance just to have it come in a little bit tighter. I'm going to drop down my resolution so I can work faster. And I'm pretty happy with that motion, so I'm going to create my custom particle now. Remember, texture faded disk will give a soft edge on each side so that there's no hard lines in between your particles. It's usually the best one to use unless you need hard lines around them. It's just better for compositing. Now that I've got that, I need to assign a texture. And I'm going to randomize this. I'm going to set the maximum opacity. And remember, with your opacity maps, this means it's fading on and fading off. I don't want that. If I were to draw over with the pen, that's fading on. That would be fading off. I do not want them to fade off or on, so I make sure it's filled at the top of each. And also remember, for light effects, I'm going to use screen. That was removing those rotation effects on it. I'm just going to randomize it a little bit, and that's already looking a little better. And we see that the particles disappeared because we ran out of time for them in this layer right here. So now they'll last longer. I'm going to rotate these a little bit to add a little more randomness and life to it. That's already looking a little better. And I'm going to change this birth and death to white to use the original color of the image. I'll add a little bit of volume shading to it as well. And remember, if you adjust your opacity when you're using screens and ads as your blending mode, that will help it from getting overexposed. And if I want this to start a little sooner, I can just slide my layer downward like that to get to the part where it's looking better. Now I need to work on the smoke. So I'm going to drop down my resolution. I'm going to duplicate this layer. Now actually, yeah, I'm going to duplicate it called smoke. I'm going to hide the fire. Go into my particle. Keep it a texture faded disk, but change the texture to the smoke. And I can see right here, layer number 3 is the pre-comp, so I choose layer number 3 there. And actually this is looking pretty good. The smoke will get larger as it dies. It'll be a little smaller. And remember, for fog and mist, you want lower opacity. For smoke, you want a higher opacity. Let's have this get a little darker as it dies. And I'll have it rise a little bit higher than the fire, which it would do. Have it live a little bit longer. And for the fire, I'm going to put the smoke behind the fire. And I just noticed I want my fire to live a little longer. Wrong layer. So I'm going to increase the life of the fire. Change the birth rate a little bit. Try the smoke on top. I'll put the smoke below it, but I'll also duplicate it and put it above it and change the opacity. Like that, so it's a more layered look. So I've got those layers going. I'm going to duplicate this top smoke, and I'm going to call it Embers. And I'll go to my particle, change the texture to the ember. But first add it into the scene. There they are. Let's increase the opacity so we can see them. Decrease the size. Now make these an ad just so they pop a little bit more. And that's already looking a lot better. I'm going to duplicate my smoke. I'm going to put a field of grass below this, just so you can see what's going to be displaced. And on the grass, I'll put a displacement map. And I changed my mind. I will duplicate this, and I'll precompose it, and I'll call it map, because it needs to be precomposed anyway for this to work. So now I go here to my displacement map, and I choose my layer. And I'll hide the other layers. See, even with that map hidden, you can see the grass being distorted, okay? And that's just showing you combining several particles together to get a look. And then using your particles as a particle map, you can see the grass distorting there. And now I'll just preview this. So remember, to achieve some effects, you're going to need to use multiple layers of particles with multiple blending modes and different physics engines, and then figure out how you want to lay them out in your scene. You can also use your particles for alpha mats or luma mats, or as you see here, you can create custom displacement maps for them as well. The displacement map is one of the things that helps sell this motion effect, because the heat would cause that displacement, and having the particles there as the map helps it fit into the shape of the displacement. So if you've already got a layer and you've already got an animation, try and reuse it for something else to save yourself some time and also help sell the effect and make it a little bit more advanced. And if you felt the embers are too big, you can make them smaller, you can make them brighter, you can do whatever you want with this. It's all up to you as the designer. It's just how fast you want to get your result and how far you want to push your idea. I'm just showing you these concepts so that you can practice them on your own time and dial them in to get the look you want.